I'm really worried about Space Marine 2. The game has been delayed, its developers Saber Interactive were sold off by their parent company Embracer Group, and the pricing model of the game indicates that we're in for a AAA title filled with all of modern gaming's most terrible tropes. Seasonal passes, the ability to pay for early access, and I wouldn't be surprised if the game featured a microtransaction shop as well. But you know what? We all know that none of this modern gaming trash matters if Space Marine 2's gameplay is actually good. I'm Jeficus and I love Warhammer Video Games, and as a Warhammer fan, I'm used to getting milked for every penny that I'm worth. But I'm not going to lie, Space Marine 2 doesn't look like it's going to be a great game. From what I've seen so far, with the exception of adding co-op to what would otherwise be a single-player campaign, the game doesn't appear to be innovating much on the gameplay presented in the first game. If what we've seen of the game is what we're going to get when it releases on September 9th, I'm just going to end up waiting for the game to go on sale because buying it in this state at a $70 price point doesn't seem worth it to me. However, there's one thing that Saber Interactive could do that would hook me and millions of other players to the game on day one, and that's to have fantastic competitive multiplayer. Make no mistake, this is where the secret sauce is going to have to be. The campaign is most likely going to feature a linear experience that you play through one time and never engage with ever again, so the game is going to have to lean on multiplayer to deliver a lot of the gameplay innovations that make a sequel great. Now, is Space Marine 2 going to smash the industry like Helldivers 2 did? Probably not, but there are a lot of things that Saber Interactive could do to introduce a solid foundation and build on that foundation over time. First of all, how do we even know that the game is going to have multiplayer? Listen, a season pass with skins for weapons and armor is included in the Gold Edition. You don't make season passes for single-player games unless you want your game to fail. So let's operate under the assumption that Saber Interactive knows what they're doing. What would multiplayer even look like in Space Marine 2? Well, let's take a look at how multiplayer looked in the first game. The original game featured a class-based system where the class that you chose determined your whole playstyle. The Tactical Marine was your classic third-person shooter run-of-the-mill Space Marine with a variety of ranged and melee weapons to choose from, and with a focus on using your ranged weapon to kill people. The Devastator was a tanky class that used heavy armaments to hold lanes or snipe, sporting weapons that had really quick time to kill values but were difficult to set up. And the Assault Marine is equipped with a jump pack, and its primary focus is to get up close so that you could take advantage of the class's melee-oriented playstyle. Additionally, each of the classes came with their own perks that you can slot to further customize your gameplay. With these three classes, the game actually managed to blend hack and slash and third-person shooter elements together to create a very fun experience. Most importantly, you were able to customize the appearance of your Space Marine, selecting from a variety of armor and, of course, chapter colors, which is really important in a third-person game where you're always looking at your character. Once you set your loadouts up, you had two primary game modes to choose from, Player vs. Player and Exterminatus. Player vs. Player had your typical assortment of maps and competitive game modes to include things like Hold the Zone, Capture the Flag, or just Annihilation. Exterminatus featured 4-player co-op where you were deployed to specific maps to fight against wave after wave of enemies with a focus on getting the highest score possible. As of May 2024, we have no idea if Space Marine 2 is going to have the same game modes such as Player vs. Player or Exterminatus, and we also have no idea if the class-based system from the first game is going to be brought over to Space Marine 2. But let's just say that at the very least, the game is going to feature Player vs. Player in some capacity, and that it's going to have a Player vs. Environment mode like Exterminatus. If it's going to have these things, then we need to talk about why these game modes completely died in the original game. For a couple of months after the launch of Space Marine, the multiplayer community was fairly healthy. Matching up with other players was consistently quick, and the game had enough of a grind to keep people going for quite a while. Personally, I got to max level in multiplayer, but never took the time to grind out every single weapon perk in the game. That being said, although the game had a massive foundation of content, Space Marine wasn't a live service game. How many times can you hop into the same Exterminatus map without any changes? Or how many times could you match up with the same players in a peer-to-peer connected PvP lobby and die because of a terrible connection? Multiplayer grew stale really quickly, and my fear is that the same thing is going to happen in Space Marine 2. Depending on what kind of multiplayer is in the game, it's competing with the likes of Helldivers 2 and Fortnite when it comes to being a third-person shooter. If what the Gold Edition reveals is true, then the game is going to be seasonal, and by that I assume they plan to have a seasonal battle pass. I expect this means that Saber Interactive will be providing a live service to include new maps, new weapons, balance changes, and new cosmetics every few months. But if this is the case, I've got one question for Saber Interactive. How do you plan to compete with Helldivers 2? If you're releasing a multiplayer PvE mode, what is it going to do that sets it apart from that industry titan? Is Saber going to take Fat Shark's approach and focus on a niche audience of gamers as shown in a game like Dark Tide? Are you going to have an ever-evolving planet-wide war campaign as innovative as the core gameplay loop of Helldivers 2? Or is Space Marine 2 going to reintroduce the same Exterminatus or Chaos Unleashed game modes that were present in the original game? I feel like a decision like that would be a great way to ensure that your game is dead on arrival. If multiplayer PvE is going to be a thing, we're going to need something that's completely unexpected. I don't think that porting Exterminatus over to 2024 is going to be good enough. The game mode that Saber introduces is going to have to be unique and, more importantly, replayable. It needs to be dynamic enough that every week that you come back to it, it's a slightly different experience. If Saber has procedural generation that they could employ like Arrowhead does for Helldivers 2 to keep the experience fresh, that may work. But I've got a strong feeling Saber doesn't have this kind of tech at all. If they did, they'd have been showing it off by now to drive pre-order sales. With that being said, I think that Space Marine 2 has a better chance to stand out and actually carve out a space within the third-person shooter player versus player scene. There hasn't been a good arena-based third-person shooter in the industry for quite some time, so I think that Saber should really double down on making PvP the best that it could possibly be. My primary recommendations, other than employing a live service model, which Saber is already doing, would be to invest in dedicated servers, crossplay, and move away from the class-based system that was introduced in the first game. Investing in dedicated servers and crossplay is kind of a no-brainer. One of the most frustrating things in Space Marine was trying to melee or shoot somebody who was teleporting around everywhere. It just really sucked. And I don't see any downsides to investing in crossplay whatsoever. Just make the community as big as it can possibly be and allow people to play with their friends on any console. But I also wanted to talk about simply moving away from the class-based system introduced in the original game, which might be seen as a hot take in the Space Marine community. In some of the Space Marine 2 footage, we see Titus simply pick up a heavy bolter and just go to town on some Tyranids. I'd like to see things like the heavy bolter and the jump pack be pickups on the map that act as very powerful armaments that change the flow of gameplay, empowering your character with something stronger than the bolt gun. This would be more reminiscent of the Halo experience, where everybody would start on a map with the same weapons, the bolt gun in this example, and scour the arena for better equipment. This would make these items hot objectives that both teams would have to fight for, and would also allow for items like the jump pack, the heavy bolter, or the plasma gun to really pack that heavy punch that you would expect out of the Space Marine's arsenal without having to worry about balance. Since these weapons would be pickups that anyone could loot, players would have to get good with every weapon in the game, and this creates a lot of replayability. The reason why I specifically bring this up is because Saber Interactive already has experience with Halo. It's one of the major studios behind the Master Chief Collection, which continues to perform very well for how old those games are. If anyone from Saber manages to watch this video, what I'm asking you to do is lean on the experience that you already have from remastering Halo. I want you to implement many of the things that made Halo successful in the first place. I know that Saber didn't create Halo, but they got their hands on the secret recipe, and I suppose we can only hope that they memorized it. Regardless, what do you think Space Marine 2 needs? Maybe you're in the opposite camp and a cinematic linear story experience is all you're looking for. If that's the case, I advise you to be conservative with your money and wait for the game to be released. Unless you're gunning for the collector's edition no matter what, don't pre-order this game until you've seen the whole picture. The fact that we're 4 months away from launch and have only seen about 30 minutes of gameplay and have heard nothing about anything other than the campaign is very scary. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they delayed the game again. Anyways, this has been Jeficus, and I'll see you in-game.